This is going to be the Crucible exam tutorial. It's going to review basically our area of reading the novel, which is, or I should say the play, and the questions that are going to be on the assessment. First thing I probably want to do, let's go over some of the portions of the assessment that deal with, say for instance, the essay portion, and then after that, then we'll look at the the matching. So the first part that we're going to do is the essay. There are 4 portions, and of these 4, they are short answers. We're looking for about 2 paragraphs for each one, and you may choose only one of the 4 to write on, so you can have your 2 paragraphs. So one of the first questions is in Act 1, and it covers the question, how do Rebecca Nurse and John Proctor's views differ from those of the other villagers? Support your ideas with details from the play. If you choose to write on this, keep in mind that Rebecca Nurse feels like after she's gone and sat down with Betty in bed and she soothes her with some quiet humming and stuff, her assessment of the situation is that these are kids being kids. They've been caught doing something, they know it was wrong, so they're playing a little game to try and get out of it. And if we just let it run its course, when they get hungry, they'll come down and eat. When they get tired of it, they'll come out of their room, and then we can deal with it then. Let's not jump to conclusions. Whereas John Proctor, although he agrees with her, he knows also something that along with the audience, the other characters don't know, is that the girls were dancing in the woods, and that they were just making this up because they know that Reverend Paris jumped in on them. However, the other villagers, how they differ or how they view this is they've used panic, hysteria, fear as a means to claim that it's witchcraft, along with, of course, like any small town and word of mouth, you have rumor after rumor after rumor. And the rumors basically speak witchcraft based on what the girls were doing, which was dancing in the woods around a fire and a kettle. And so, and you also have certain villagers who are trying to spread this rumor, such as the Putnam family, because they are so angry at their neighbors. Okay, moving on to the second question, which would be from Act 2. Proctor accuses Hale of being a Pontius Pilate and a coward, but Proctor could be considered a coward too, and how might both men be considered guilty of cowardice? Use the details from the play to support your ideas. Well, Proctor, of course, has committed adultery. He knows this, and he's ashamed of it. He also knows that Abigail is behind all this manifesting of stuff that's going on in the town, and if he was truly honorable, as he says he is, he would march to the governor's place and tell him straight out that basically the girls are lying, that this is what's going on, and that it's because of this. However, he's having trouble facing that truth, and so he tiptoes around his wife, trying to avoid fights. He hasn't really gotten any closure out of the deal, and so he can be considered a coward in a sense because he's not afraid to face his demons. Whereas Reverend Hale at this part, from Act 1 to Act 2, is starting to doubt a little bit about the stories that he's hearing. How can so many people be involved with the devil? However, he's already obligated himself in the first act of finding some people who he feels have been, possessed by the devil because they've confessed, and so that would speak a little bit about him not truly being able to identify people who are possessed or demonic, and so it may look bad upon him and how he can do his job. So even though he has certain things that are put in front of him as a minister that he can say, hey, this doesn't make sense, he still backs the original scenario when he first came in. Now, Act 3, the question is, John Proctor is reluctant to become involved in the trials because he doesn't want to damage his reputation. But do you think people in general should risk their personal reputations for the greater good? And explain why or why not. Can you think of any situations where people should take this step? So it's wanting you to make a comparison to real life and the fact that, Proctor knows that if he does this, he's going to ruin his good name. However, he would be saving a lot of people's lives. He would be, doing a greater good for more than just his individual self. And the question of, do you think people should risk their personal reputations for a greater good? Well, let's look at that. You need to analyze really and truly the sacrifice that is being made, because once you make that sacrifice, you can likely take it back. If Proctor goes and he throws away his good name, he will forever be looked upon by the entire town as a lecher, someone who's cheated on his wife. And so it doesn't matter what he does, what good works he occurs, he will always have that stigma around him. And keep in mind, it also will affect his family. I mean, his sons will grow up, and they will be the sons of an adulterer. His wife feels sorry for her all the time because she's stuck with the man who's cheated, and how can she possibly trust him? And it can damage friendships. That kind of dealing you have to deal with the rest of your life is not an easy task. However, if doing so can alleviate a greater good, and you look at the overall picture, then what are some of the benefits by making that that risk? And are there situations where people should take this step? Well, I guess it greatly depends, and that's going to be one that you're going to have to come up with. All right, and the last question, which is question number 4, a crucible. Well, basically the definition is a severe test or trial. What test did the characters in this play have to face? And which characters do you believe failed the test, and which of them passed? And use examples from the play. So, for instance, if you're talking about Mary Warren, here's somebody at the beginning of the play who's a scared little mouse, who's just somebody trying to fit in, to Act 2 giving power to accuse people and abusing this power and thinking that she's above others. And then in Act 3, having the ability to come clean with it. Does she come clean? And does she pass her test, or does she fail? Giles Corey is another one who opens his mouth in the beginning and gets his wife in trouble by saying she reads strange books. And now she's put in a corner that he can't get her out of. And then he has the opportunity in Act 3 to probably do the same thing to someone else, but he might be able to free his wife. Does he pass his test? And, of course, we know about John Proctor. You also look at Reverend Parris. He knows the truth of what's been going on, or suspects it at least, and he has many, many opportunities to try and come clean and help the people that he is supposed to be the minister of. Does he come through or fail or pass the test? So these are the 4 questions you will write on. Let's move on to vocabulary. These are your vocabulary words. Baffled. If you're baffled by something, you're very puzzled. You're mystified. You don't understand. Perjury. If you commit perjury, that means you've gone under a witness stand, maybe for a judge or something like that, and you've lied because you're under oath. Remorseless. If you're remorseless, that means you have no mercy. You have no pity on anyone. You are basically a hardcore individual, very cold person. Anonymity. This is a condition of being nameless or obscure. If you're in anonymity, that means that people don't see you, they don't hear you. You still exist, but they don't see where you're at. Prodigious. Prodigious is kind of like a remarkable or very large thing that occurs. Okay, very prodigious. Adamant. If you are adamant, you will not yield, you will not move, you will be strong and forthright where you're at. Penitence. This is when you have sorrow for your sins, for wrongdoing or misdoing. If you're a penitent person, you're asking for forgiveness. To beguile somebody is to trick or to fool or charm. If you are gaunt, then you're thin and bony. People who are gaunt usually are malnourished or they're stressed out. Stench. That's basically a foul, stinky smell. Calamity. If something is a calamity, it is a disaster, just a total disaster. Magistrate is an official judge of the court that has been assigned for the court. Sarcasm, basically when you make cutting remarks or you're taunting someone. And to begrudge somebody is to feel ill will towards another person if you're begrudging them. And then if you're evasively, you're not straightforward. You're trying to go around, or you're trying to act in a tricky way so that you can be an evasive individual. Okay, so let's continue on then with the basic questions from the story. And first of all, something that'll foreshadow the events to come. In Act 1, there's an event that occurs that seems to foreshadow some of the events of how the people are going to argue with each other. And that basically is the relationship between Abigail and John Proctor. If you notice that because they have had some sort of relationship that has happened in the past that's just being brought into light in the Act 1, we can foreshadow or see this being a cause or a potential problem, because for Abigail, it's not over, and for John Proctor, he's wanting it to be over. Thomas Putnam, here's an individual who is a very spiteful, vindictive individual who he's upset because he doesn't have any sons, and his wife is given birth to a bunch of stillborns, so he's not exactly the nicest person. Reverend Paris, on the other hand, this guy he's very reluctant or hesitant to tell anyone that Betty may be bewitched, because what he's worried about most of all is his reputation, being fired, being seen as a fraud, and that means more to him than his daughter actually being possessed. The dramatic exposition in Act 1, this is where we hear reveal from the characters arguing and stuff about deeds and boundaries to property and things of that nature. What it does is it prepares us for the argument of John Proctor and Thomas Putnam and who has land disputes and disagreements over that land and stuff. Now, most of the villagers, in review of Rebecca Nurse, they see her as a very pious, kind, and respectable woman who is to be respected on a religious level. Reverend Paris, on the other hand, again, being most concerned with his reputation, is someone that supports Abigail only because Abigail is his niece primarily, and he's raising her, so it reflects him. Abigail, before this story begins, goes into the forest because she wants to get rid of Goody Proctor and has a charm made for that. So we can infer or assume that the citizens of Salem thought dancing was evil and sinful because the girls had to do it in hiding during the night. Abigail, we know that she's not harmless as she appears, because she even makes a threat, quoting, I can make you wish you'd never seen the sun go down, which is, she's threatening to hurt or kill somebody in that regard. Tituba, being the slave, we know that she most likely confessed to being a witch or seeing the devil simply because she didn't want to die. She was threatened to be whipped to death or to be hanged, and so she wanted to save her life. As far as John Proctor is concerned, he's an individual who rebels against authority because he speaks his mind, and so that's a threat to someone like Thomas Putnam or to Reverend Paris because he doesn't go along with the norm. And Rebecca, she advises Paris to send Reverend Hale away in Act 1 because she knew that his presence would only cause more hysteria and issues in Salem that they already need because the neighbors are already fighting with each other. Now we go to Act 2, and Elizabeth urges John to go to Salem. Now, she does this because she wants him to tell the court that Abigail's story is a hoax and a lie. She doesn't want anyone else to have to suffer because of her, and also because she has a vendetta and grudge against her, obviously because she slept with her husband. However, she also makes a comment of what Mary Warren has told her in Act 2, where people part like the seas for Abigail because they fear her power to accuse them, kind of like Moses had the power to part the Red Seas. They are afraid of what power she might exact on them. And by the end of Act 2, Reverend Hale, when he's introduced into this, he begins to worry that maybe these people who are being accused are innocent. However, in the Act 2, they show that Sarah Good is accused of witchcraft because she couldn't recite the 10 Commandments, and they had her in a lie. However, at first, when Mary Warren's discussing this story, you can tell she enjoys her role in court because she's got the power, and she has a status in the village all of a sudden. And she even says, she says, I cannot tell the truth in court at the very end because after she's received this status, she's afraid that, and as all the girls are, they're afraid of Abigail. They're afraid of what Abigail will do to them. However, Proctor tells her, my wife will never die for me. And he says this because he knows that his adultery that he's committed is what's causing this issue of Elizabeth being arrested. It's not because she's a bad person or she's done anything. Mary Warren in Act 2 reveals that Goody Osborne were hanged, but Sarah Good won't because, she confessed. And that's how you get out of it, is by the confession. In Act 3, moving to it, the details of the setting create a mood that's really gloomy and forbidding in that courtroom as Giles Corey's wife is being tried. When Abigail says to Danforth during this trial, think you might be so mighty that the power of hell may not turn your wits? Beware of it. she's threatening him and using her power to threaten him, and he's the judge, so that's going to cause a little bit of row in there. Also in Act 3, we can conclude about Reverend Parris, or what we can assume about him at the end is he's just a coward. He has the ability to change things as well because he knows what's going on in the end, but he's a wretched individual who's too cowardly to change, and he continues to fan from his pulpit and from there accusing people. Elizabeth Proctor was brought in to justify John Proctor's accusations, and she didn't tell Danforth that Abigail was a harlot because she wanted to save John's reputation. She was protecting her husband. And really, when you talk about the best line that would express the real truth behind the trials, the witch trials, there's a quote that says, "Private vengeance is working through this testimony." And that's basically the court scene, is that everybody who is accusing other people, it's a private vengeance that they've gotten over the years of knowing these people. Giles Corey is arrested because he refuses simply to accuse or give the name of the person who accused the Putnam of grabbing land. At the end of this, Hale begins to seriously doubt the morality and motivations of the trial, and especially when he signs Rebecca's death sentence. And he even says, I signed away her name. And he has a very bad feeling about that. And by the end of the Act 3, he actually leaves the courts. Francis Nurse is terrified in Act 3 when Danforth insists that the people who are on that list of names, the 90 names of 91 people, Francis promised them no harm would come to him. However, Danforth insists that they be arrested for questioning. Hale denounces the proceedings at the end by simply leaving because he believes that Mary Warren and John Proctor's testimony was true. By Act 4, what we can conclude from the references to Andover, which is an outside town of Salem, is that the people are rebelling and overthrowing the court. The reason why it's important for Danforth and Parris that Proctor confess in Act 4 is that they think his confession will convince the people that the court has been just and that they haven't made a mistake. So they send Elizabeth down to talk to John, but after talking with her and stuff, she even says at the end he has his goodness now, which means he has his self-respect and knows there is goodness in him by tearing up the confession that he was going to give. And that's what the climax of Act 4 is the ripping up of the confession, dooming himself physically. Parris's real reason for wanting Proctor saved isn't for Proctor's soul or for anything like that. It's because of the concern for his own safety, as always. Danforth refuses to postpone the hanging simply because it might look like he wrongly executed innocent people, and instead of stopping there and stopping the execution of even more innocent people, he'd rather worry about him and his reputation as well in the courts. Giles Corey is pressed in Act 4, even though we don't see it, but we can always describe him as a courageous individual because of the fact that he was able to endure torture to death. We can infer Abigail and Mercy left Salem because they simply they feared that the villagers would turn on them. And during this act, the beginning, cows are wandering the high roads of Salem, and children are wandering from place to place, orphans. It's because many of the farmers or their parents have been put in jail, and they can't take care of themselves or the farms, as far as that goes. Okay, moving on to the real Salem witch trials that happened in real life. The name of the reverend who helped spread the witches, spread of the idea of witches, was Reverend Parris. And in real life, there was 20 people who were executed. Now, we count Giles Corey as among those 20 because he was tortured to death in an executed style. The reverend's niece is Abigail, and the name of the hill people were hung on was Gallows Hill. What the name of the slaves owned by the reverend who told the story was, of course, Tituba. She was the slave. And Rebecca Nurse was 71 years old when she was arrested. The year that the trials took place was 1692, and the year that the Puritans actually came to the New World was 1630. However, in 1486, this book was written, which gave people a guide on how to find, deal, and punish witches, and it was called the Hammer of Witches. The hanging judge was known as Judge Hawthorne in real life, and Giles Corey died by pressing, and it took around 35 to 40 hours to do this, almost a 48-hour torture. Sarah Good, who was arrested for witchcraft, her profession was she was just a beggar. And when a victim brought evidence to the court that they were being attacked by a witch, it was called spectral evidence. If a person was a man and they were accused of being a witch and they died, the government got their land after they died. Nathaniel Hawthorne, who is the great-great-grandson of the hanging judge Hawthorne, changed his last name, to an E, and he wrote The House of Seven Gables. In the fall of 1692, a petition was written to help put a stop to the witch trials. In the end, today, in today's society in Salem, there are over 3,000 actual witches living in Salem. A couple of the theories behind how these witch trials kept going was, one of the theories was ergot was being grown on some of the wheat that caused convulsions, or that, if there was a witch, it would have been Tituba, who might have practiced what they call voodoo. Whoever confesses, there was only one person who confessed after it was all said and done to lying by signing their name after the trials were over, and that was Ann Putnam. The name of the Salem village now is called Danvers, and it took over 300 years after the trials before the town finally did create a memorial in memory of the victims lost. Reverend Parris was thrown out of town when it was all said and done, and of course, with him went his voodoo ritual slave Tituba. And that's pretty much it. Good luck on your assessment.